Samuel Reed drove the shovel into frozen earth for the third time that night, and still couldn't break through. His hands were bleeding. He didn't stop. Somewhere beneath 2 feet of Wyoming ice lay the last photograph of his wife, the one he'd buried because looking at it was killing him slower than any bullet could. He was done being careful, done being slow, done surviving. Then the knock came. 3 small fists against his door, and a voice so thin the wind nearly swallowed it whole.
"Mister, please, Mama won't wake up."
If this story reaches your heart, hit subscribe and follow along until the very last word, because this one doesn't end where you think it does. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The knock came at 7 minutes past midnight. Samuel knew the time because he always knew the time. Sleep hadn't lived in this house for 3 years. Not since the night Eleanor died with her fingers still wrapped around his, and the baby never drew a single breath. He'd learned to mark the hours the way a man marks fence posts, one after another, just to prove the line was still holding. He was at the table when he heard it, not reading, not eating, just sitting with a cup of coffee gone cold, and the particular silence that only widowers understand. The kind that isn't peaceful, the kind that presses against your chest like a hand that won't let go. 3 knocks, small, uneven. Samuel didn't move right away. Out here in Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory, a man who opened his door too fast at midnight didn't always live to regret it. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, same as he'd learned most lessons, through blood and loss and the kind of quiet aftermath that follows both. He set down the cup, reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, stood. The knock came again, softer this time, almost apologetic. Then a voice.
"Mister, please."
High and thin and shaking. A child. Samuel crossed the room in 4 strides and pulled the door open. The cold lunged inside like it had been waiting. Snow driving sideways, wind screaming low across the fields, the night so dark it had weight to it. And standing on his porch, half swallowed by a coat 3 sizes too large, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, red hair plastered to her face in wet ropes. Eyes so wide and so frightened they looked like 2 holes cut straight through to something terrible. Her lips were nearly white. She was shaking so hard he could hear her teeth. She stared up at him like she wasn't sure whether to run or beg. He lowered the rifle slowly. "Easy," he said, voice rough from a week of not using it. "You're all right." She shook her head.
"No, sir," she said. "Mama won't wake up."
She was real hot this morning, and now she's cold. And I called her name 100 times, and she won't. Her voice broke clean in half. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, hard, like she was trying to push the crying back inside. "Please, I don't know what else to do." Samuel looked past her into the dark. Nothing but white fields and black tree line, and the blizzard doing its worst. "Where's your house?" he asked. She pointed south, past the creek. The little one with the leaky roof. Mama always said if something bad happened, I should find the rancher with the big fence. She said, she swallowed hard. She said, good people keep good fences. Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. His fence. His land. His problem now, whether he'd asked for it or not. He stepped back from the door. "Come inside." She hesitated for just a second, the hesitation of a child who'd been taught not to trust easily. And then the cold made the decision for her, and she stepped over the threshold. The warmth hit her like a wall. She swayed. He caught her by the shoulder before her knees gave out entirely, steered her toward the fire, wrapped the nearest blanket around her without a word. She was soaked straight through, light as a bundle of sticks. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching to her level.
Pearl,
She whispered.
Pearl Calloway.
Pearl. He said it once, steady, the way you'd say the name of something you needed to remember. "I'm Samuel Reed. You did right coming here." She looked at him with eyes older than her face had any business wearing.
Are you going to help her?
He was already pulling on his coat. "Stay by the fire," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone." Pearl grabbed his sleeve. Her small fingers were like ice.
Can I come?
He looked at her for a moment. She was still shaking, still half frozen. If he left her here alone and something went wrong. "Come on," he said. He carried her most of the way. The creek was a quarter-mile south, mostly frozen, black water whispering under a crust of ice that creaked under his boots. He crossed slow, testing each step, Pearl's arms tight around his neck, her face buried against his shoulder. The wind screamed. Snow packed itself into every crease of his coat, his collar, the gap between his hat and his ears. He kept moving, kept his head down. The house appeared out of the dark like something that had given up trying. It was small, one room, maybe two, with a roof that sagged on the left side and a window whose glass had been replaced with oilcloth. Faint light bled through it, amber and guttering, a fire dying down to nothing. He pushed the door open. The smell inside hit him first, sickness and cold sweat, and the particular stillness of a room where something is very wrong. A woman lay on the bed against the far wall, blankets piled on top of her, dark hair fanned out on the pillow, face the color of new ash. Samuel crossed to her in 3 strides and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse. Weak. Uneven. But there. "She's alive," he said. Behind him, Pearl made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something between a prayer and a sob, and it hit him somewhere deep, somewhere he'd thought was too scarred to feel anything anymore. "You hear that, Pearl? Your mama's still here." He worked fast, stoked the fire first, checked the woman's breathing. Shallow, wet, the sound of fluid where there shouldn't be. Fever that had broken wrong, cold filling in behind it like water rushing into a cracked hull. Pneumonia, most likely. He'd seen it before. Seen what it did when it wasn't caught in time. He'd seen what it did when it was caught too late. "Not this time," he said under his breath. He didn't know who he was saying it to. He lifted her carefully. She weighed less than he expected, less than she should have, and wrapped her in every blanket he could find in the room. 2 quilts, a horse blanket from a nail by the door, his own coat off his back. Pearl was already at the door, holding it open, eyes fixed on her mother's face. "We're taking her back to my place," Samuel said. "It's warmer. I've got medicine. Can you carry the lantern?" Pearl took it in both hands without a word and walked out into the blizzard like she'd done it 100 times. The walk back was longer. His arms burned by the time they hit the creek. He crossed slower, more careful, the woman's weight shifting with every step on the ice. He didn't let himself think about falling. Didn't let himself think about anything except the next step, and the one after that, and the light Pearl was holding steady ahead of him in the dark. He'd carried another woman through a winter night once before. He hadn't made it in time. He walked faster. Back at the ranch, he laid Dorothy Calloway. He found her name on a folded letter tucked in her coat pocket, in his own bed, stoked every fire in the house, lit every lantern he owned. The house blazed against the dark, like something daring the night to come closer. He worked through the small hours, cool cloths on her forehead, measured sips of broth when she stirred enough to swallow. A dose of the powdered medicine he kept on the top shelf, the kind the doctor in Rollins had given him 3 years ago for a purpose he'd never had to use it for. He whispered things he wasn't sure she could hear. "Stay with us. Your girl needs you. Stay." Pearl sat curled at the foot of the bed, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. She didn't sleep. She didn't cry anymore. She just watched, with the stillness of a child who had already learned that sometimes the only thing you could do was bear witness. Around 3 in the morning, Samuel brought her a piece of cornbread and set it on the blanket beside her without comment. She looked up at him. "Why do you have so many lanterns?" He settled into the chair by the bed. "Habit," he said. She considered this with the seriousness of someone twice her age. "My papa used to say that the dark isn't scary if you know what's in it." Samuel looked at the lantern on the nightstand, its flame small and steady. "Your papa was right." "He died," Pearl said. Not dramatically, just as fact. 2 years ago. Bad men shot him and took our land. That's why Mama and me ran." Samuel was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. Wind pressed against the windows. "She never told anyone," Pearl added. "She said it wasn't safe to tell." He looked at the girl and then back at the woman in the bed. He looked at the hollows under Dorothy Calloway's cheekbones and the way her hands, even in sleep, were curled slightly inward. The posture of someone braced for the next blow. He'd seen that before, too. "Get some rest," he said finally. "I'll be here." Pearl lay down at the foot of the bed, still wrapped in her blanket, still watching her mother. Within 10 minutes, she was asleep, one hand stretched out to just barely touch the hem of Dorothy's quilt. Samuel watched them both. He should have felt like a stranger in his own house. Should have felt like the intrusion of 2 lives, warm, breathing, needing, into the careful blankness he'd built around himself. He'd been so deliberate about it, sending the ranch hands away for the winter, not riding into town, not answering letters, not letting anything in. Instead, he felt the house around him differently than he had in 3 years. Not emptier, the opposite. He poured himself a cup of coffee, and it was hot for the first time in a long while. Just before dawn, Dorothy Calloway opened her eyes. She stared at the ceiling for a moment, confused. Then she tried to sit up, and a cough tore through her chest so hard she doubled over it. Samuel was beside her before she'd finished drawing the next breath. "Easy," he said. "Don't push it." She looked at him. Fear, immediate and electric. Her eyes cut to the left, searching. "I'm here, Mama." Pearl was on her feet before the words were fully out, scrambling up onto the bed, wrapping both arms around her mother's neck. Dorothy pulled her in so hard and fast it was almost violent, her face buried in Pearl's hair, shoulders shaking. "Oh, God," she breathed. "Oh, Pearl. Oh, thank God." "I found the ranch with the big fence," Pearl said into her mother's shoulder. "Just like you said." "He helped, Mama. He brought you all the way through the snow." Dorothy raised her head. She looked at Samuel the way frontier women learn to look at strange men. Not hostile, just measuring. Stripping away the surface to find whether the thing underneath was safe or wasn't. He held her gaze and didn't look away from it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was barely there, scraped raw. "I don't even know your name." "Samuel Reed," he said. "You're welcome." She swallowed. "Dorothy Calloway." A pause. Dot. He nodded once. "You were very sick, Mrs. Calloway. You still are. You need rest and heat. You're not going anywhere for a few days." Something moved across her face. Not gratitude. Something more complicated than that. Like the effort of accepting help was its own kind of pain for her. "I can't impose." "You're not," he said flatly. "The barn needs a new roof latch, and half my fences need checking. I've got room and I've got medicine. That's all this is." She looked at him for a long moment. You sound like a man who's learned how to make charity sound practical. I sound like a man who doesn't want to argue before sunrise, he replied. Pearl, still tucked under her mother's arm, looked up at him with sudden, fierce loyalty. I think he's nice, Mama. Dorothy's mouth curved, just slightly. The first real expression he'd seen on her face since she'd opened her eyes. Go to sleep, Pearl, she said. I'm not tired. You were asleep 10 minutes ago. That was different tired. Samuel stood, moved back toward the chair. Behind him, he heard Dorothy's voice drop low, heard Pearl's answering murmur, heard the sound of a mother checking her child over, the quiet inventory of touch, counting fingers, smoothing hair, making sure everything was still there and whole and hers. He sat down and looked at the window. Outside, the snow had slowed. The sky in the east had started to go gray. He hadn't watched a sunrise in a long time. He'd been awake for them, but watching was different. Watching meant you expected something from the day. He watched this one. It was just past full light when the sound reached him. Hooves, distant, moving at a pace that had purpose to it. He was at the window before he'd made the decision to stand, his hand finding the rifle on the wall by instinct. In the yard, 2 horses. 2 men still in the tree line, not approaching, just watching the house. Samuel stood very still. They were too far to see faces, but one of them wore something on his chest that caught the early light. Metal, small, catching it like a wink. A badge. Not a real one, Samuel's gut told him. Real law didn't sit in the tree line watching houses at dawn. Real law knocked. He watched them until they turned and disappeared back into the trees. Then he went back to the chair, set the rifle across his knees, and kept his eyes on the window, while the woman in his bed slept, and the child at her feet dreamed, and the morning did what mornings did. Came anyway, whether you were ready for it or not. He thought about what Pearl had said in the dark. Bad men shot him and took our land. He thought about the way Dorothy Calloway had curled her hands, even in unconsciousness. Braced. Always braced. He thought about the men in the tree line, and the glint of a badge that wasn't honest. Then he thought about Eleanor, the way he always did when something pulled at the edges of the life he'd sealed shut. He thought about what she would have said if she'd been standing beside him at that window, watching those 2 horses stand in the shadows. She would have said, Sam, you already know what you're going to do. She was right. He always had. He'd just stopped letting himself do it. He looked at the rifle across his knees. Then he looked at the bed, at the woman breathing slow and even now, at the little girl with the red hair sleeping with her hand still touching the edge of her mother's quilt. Dorothy Calloway had run as far as the snow would let her. The men in the tree line had followed. And Samuel Reed had opened his door. Whether he understood yet what that meant, what it would cost him, what it would give him back, what was already beginning to shift in the cold, careful architecture of a life built around staying still, that was a different question. For now, he set another log on the fire, kept the lanterns burning, and watched the door. The men came back that afternoon. Samuel heard the horses before he saw them, 2 sets of hooves moving slow and deliberate up the road, the kind of pace that wasn't traveling anywhere, just announcing. He set down the harness he'd been mending and stood in the barn doorway, arms loose at his sides, watching. Roy Decker was the one who spoke first. Samuel didn't know his name yet, but he knew the type. The kind of man who borrowed authority from whoever was paying him, and wore it like a coat that didn't fit right. He had a broad face, a week's growth of beard, and eyes that were doing inventory on everything they touched. The other one, younger, stayed half a length behind on his horse, and kept his hand too close to his hip. "Afternoon," Decker said, pulling up short of the barn. "Saw lights on last night. Thought we'd check in." "I don't recall asking you to," Samuel said. Decker smiled like that was friendly. It wasn't. "Heard there's a woman staying here. Woman and a child." "You heard wrong." "That's so." He leaned forward on the saddle horn. Easy. Conversational. The way a man leans when he wants you to think he's relaxed. "See, we're looking for someone. Widow woman. Red-haired little girl. Traveling through from Colorado way. Her family's been real worried." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. "Can't help you." "You sure? Because the description—" "I said I can't help you." Samuel's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "You're on my land. I didn't invite you, and I'm not going to. So you can turn those horses around now, or you can explain to me exactly who sent you and why, and we can have a different kind of conversation altogether." The younger one shifted in his saddle. Decker's smile thinned down to something that wasn't a smile at all. "Just trying to reunite a family," Decker said. "No, you're not," Samuel replied. "And we both know it. Ride on." There was a pause that stretched out long and tight as a fence wire in January. Then Decker touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that meant nothing good, and pulled his horse around. The younger one followed without a word. Samuel stood in the doorway until they'd cleared the property line and disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he stood there a little longer, because men like that had a habit of circling back. When he came inside, Dorothy was sitting up in bed for the first time. Pearl was perched beside her, reading aloud from a battered almanac she'd found on his shelf, her finger tracking each word with intense concentration. Dorothy had her hand resting on Pearl's back, and she looked up when Samuel came through the door with the particular alertness of a woman who'd learned to read rooms fast. "Someone was here," she said. It wasn't a question. He pulled off his coat and hung it. "Two men, looking for a widow and a red-haired girl." Dorothy's hand tightened on Pearl's back. Pearl stopped reading and looked up at her mother, then at Samuel. "What did you tell them?" Dorothy asked. Her voice was steady. He could see what it cost her to keep it that way. "That I couldn't help them," Samuel said. "They'll be back." She closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, something in her expression had shifted. Not fear exactly, more like the look of a woman who'd been running long enough that even sitting still felt like losing ground. "I brought this to your door," she said quietly. "I didn't know—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed." "Samuel," he said. She looked at him. "My name is Samuel," he repeated. "And you don't owe me an apology. You owe me the truth." Pearl closed the almanac carefully and set it on the blanket. She looked between the two adults the way children do when they understand more than the adults realize. Quietly, precisely, holding her breath. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His name is Harlan Voss. He owns most of Colfax County, Colorado. He wanted our land, my husband Henry's land. Henry wouldn't sell, so Voss sent men." Her voice didn't waver, but she was gripping the edge of the quilt with both hands. "They made it look like a robbery. Pearl and I were in town that day. When we came back—" She stopped again. Samuel waited. He didn't push. Some things had to come at their own pace, or they didn't come at all. "He has a lawyer," Dorothy continued. "He has judges. He has men who wear badges that aren't real badges and do what he tells them to do. I couldn't prove anything. I couldn't stay. I took Pearl, and I took what I could carry, and I left." She looked up at him. "I thought if I got far enough north, far enough out of his reach—" "You thought Wyoming would be far enough," Samuel said. "I thought wrong." She let go of the quilt. Voss doesn't let things go. He never has. That's how he got rich. He just doesn't stop. Samuel pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. How long have they been following you? I don't know for certain. I noticed someone watching us in Laramie 2 weeks ago. I moved fast after that. She looked at Pearl. Too fast, as it turns out. Pearl reached over and took her mother's hand without ceremony, the way children do, not to comfort, just to be present. Dorothy looked down at their joined hands, and something in her face went soft for just a moment before she pulled it back together. I'm not your problem, Dorothy said, looking back at Samuel. We can leave as soon as I'm able to ride. I won't. You can't ride, he said. In a few days. You had pneumonia 2 days ago, Samuel said. In this weather, on a horse? In a few days, you'd have it again before you cleared the county line. And Pearl would be alone. Dorothy pressed her mouth shut. She knew he was right. He could see it in the way she hated that he was right. Then what do you suggest? She asked, and the edge in her voice wasn't unfriendly. It was the edge of a woman who'd been making her own decisions for 2 hard years and didn't know how to stop. I suggest you rest, Samuel said, and let me think. You're not obligated, Mrs. Calloway. He said it once, level, and she stopped. I opened my door. That made this my business. I don't do things halfway. He stood, picked up the chair, put it back where it belonged. Now drink the broth Pearl's going to heat up for you, and sleep. We'll talk more when you're stronger. Pearl was already on her feet, heading for the stove with a purpose that made Samuel think she'd been waiting for something useful to do for 2 days. Dorothy watched him for a long moment. You're either the most decent man I've met in 2 years, she said, or you're the most stubborn. Probably both, Samuel said, and went back outside. The afternoon passed in the way afternoons do when people are learning the shape of each other's silences. Samuel repaired the fence latch that had been broken since October. Pearl came to find him around 2 o'clock, bundled up so thoroughly in her coat and scarf that only her eyes and the tip of her red nose were visible, and stood watching him work with the focused attention of someone taking notes. What broke it? She asked. Ice got into the joint, he said. Expanded. Push the pin loose. She considered this. Like how Mama's hands crack in the cold? Something like that. She was quiet for a moment. Mr. Samuel? Just Samuel. Samuel. She tried it out. Why do you live all by yourself? He kept working. It suits me. Mama says people who say things suit them usually mean they got used to them. She paused. Did you get used to being alone? Samuel set down the wrench and looked at her. She was watching him with those dark eyes, patient, curious, completely unaware that she'd just walked straight through a wall it had taken him 3 years to build. Your mama's smart, he said finally. Pearl nodded. She says that too. She picked up a piece of wire from the ground and turned it over in her fingers. We used to have a ranch in Colorado. Papa built the fence himself. He said, good fences meant good neighbors. She paused. We don't have the ranch anymore. I know, Samuel said quietly.
Do you think we'll ever have another one?
He looked at her for a long moment, at the absolute honesty of the question. No self-pity in it, just a child who wanted to know the shape of what was coming so she could prepare herself for it. I think your mama's the kind of woman who builds things back, he said. Yes. Pearl seemed to weigh this carefully. Then she nodded, set the wire down and said, I'm going to name that rooster, the loud one. His name is going to be General Sherman. He'll hate it, Samuel said. Good, Pearl replied, and walked back toward the barn with the authority of someone who had just settled an important matter. Samuel watched her go. Something in his chest moved. Not painful, just present. Like a muscle that hadn't been used in a while, remembering it existed. He went back to the fence. That evening, Dorothy was well enough to sit at the table. She moved carefully, one hand trailing the wall for the first half of it, but she made it on her own and sat down straight-backed, refusing the extra blanket Samuel offered, with a look that told him clearly she had a line, and that was it. Pearl served the stew. She'd helped Samuel make it, mostly by standing on the stool and stirring while he cut the vegetables and answered questions about why onions went in before carrots and not the other way around. When she set the bowl in front of her mother, her face held the particular pride of someone presenting something they'd built. "Pearl made it," Samuel said. Dorothy looked at her daughter. "Did you?" "I stirred," Pearl clarified honestly. "Samuel did the knife parts, because I'm not allowed." "Smart rule," Dorothy said, and took a sip. Her eyebrows moved slightly. "This is good." "Samuel knows how to cook," Pearl announced. "He said his wife taught him." The word landed in the room and stayed there. Dorothy looked up. Samuel kept his eyes on his bowl. "I'm sorry," Dorothy said, quietly enough that it was meant only for him. 3 years ago, Samuel said. He picked up his spoon. Her name was Eleanor. Dorothy nodded once. She didn't push further, and he understood she wasn't going to. She'd lost someone too, and she knew that some doors you knocked on, and some doors you just acknowledged and walked past. They ate in a silence that was different from the silence of the past few days, less careful, more like the silence of people who are beginning to understand they can breathe the same air without it costing them something. After dinner, Pearl fell asleep by the fire almost mid-sentence, her head dropping onto the arm of the chair while she was in the middle of telling Samuel about General Sherman's behavior that afternoon. Dorothy watched her daughter sleep with the expression mothers wear when they think no one is looking. Something so stripped of performance, it was almost hard to witness. "She's the reason I kept moving," Dorothy said softly. "Every time I wanted to stop. Just stop, Mr. Reed. Just give in and let Voss have whatever he wanted and be done with it. I'd look at her." She paused. "She doesn't give up. She never has. 8 years old, and she's already braver than I know how to be." "She got it from somewhere," Samuel said. Dorothy looked at him sideways. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't be kind about it. I ran. I packed up in the middle of the night and I ran, and I'm still running, and a kind man sitting across a table from me, calling it something else, doesn't change what it was." Samuel set down his cup. He looked at her directly. "Running to protect your child isn't something to be ashamed of, Mrs. Calloway." "Dot," she said. The word came out like it surprised her. "Dot," he said. "You ran because staying would have gotten Pearl killed. There's no version of that story where you were wrong." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Say the true thing without making it sound like a sermon." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, but it was close. "Practice," Samuel said. "Lots of winters, alone." This time the almost smile went a little further. The fire settled. Pearl made a small sound in her sleep and pulled her knees up tighter. Outside, the wind had dropped to a low moan, the blizzard spending itself out at last. "They'll go back to Voss," Dorothy said. "Those men. They'll tell him where I am." "Yes," Samuel said. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "And Voss will send more." She looked at the fire. "He's not going to stop, Samuel. I want you to understand that before you decide to keep being decent about this. He has money and patience, and neither of those runs out fast." "Neither does a man on his own land," Samuel said. She looked at him. "This isn't your fight," He stood, moved to the window, looked out at the dark. The lanterns on the porch were still burning, 2 steady points of amber in the black. He'd lit them out of habit. He'd been lighting them every night for 3 years without examining why, just following the thread of a ritual that had kept him tethered to the shape of living when everything else had come loose. He thought about Eleanor, about what she'd told him the last winter they had together, when he'd been complaining about a neighbor's trouble that wasn't strictly his business. "Sam," she'd said, "the only way a good man keeps being good is by doing it when it's inconvenient. Otherwise, it doesn't count." "No," he said finally, still looking out the window. "It's not my fight." He turned. "But you knocked on my door, and I let you in. That's enough." Dorothy studied him from across the room. Her eyes were the color of creek water in October, and they were doing the same measuring they'd done when she first opened them in his bed. Not suspicious, just honest, looking for the thing underneath the surface to find out whether it held. "Why?" she asked. Just that. Just the one word. Samuel thought about it. Thought about Eleanor, about the empty winters, about the photograph he'd buried in the frozen ground and then dug back up because he couldn't leave it there. About the door he'd sealed shut and the knock that had opened it again. "Because it was the right thing," he said. "And I stopped doing the right thing for a while. Figured it was time to remember how." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up her cup, and the gesture was simple and ordinary, but something in the way she did it, settled, less braced, as if a fraction of the weight she carried had shifted slightly, told him something he didn't have words for yet. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I will anyway." She stood, slowly, and helped Pearl up from the chair. Pearl stirred and murmured something about General Sherman without fully waking. Dorothy guided her toward the bed, one hand steady at her daughter's back, and paused at the doorway. "Samuel," she said. He looked up. "Thank you. Not just for tonight." She paused. "For all of it." He nodded once. She went inside. Samuel put on his coat, picked up his rifle, and sat in the chair by the window. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky had cracked open just enough to show a scatter of stars, cold and remote and absolutely indifferent to the lives being lived beneath them. Somewhere on that road, 2 men were riding toward Harlan Voss with news. Samuel looked at the lanterns, looked at the door. He'd opened it once. He wasn't going to close it again. 3 days passed, the way hard days do. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a particular weight of time that knows it's being counted. Dorothy got stronger, not fast, not the way a young woman bounces back from sickness, but steadily, the way a tree straightens after a storm. 1 degree at a time, with effort in every inch of it. She started making the morning coffee on the 2nd day without asking permission. On the 3rd day, she mended 2 of Pearl's stockings and refolded the blankets on the spare cot with the neat efficiency of someone who needed to be useful the way other people needed air. Samuel watched all of it without comment. He understood that kind of need. He'd felt it himself, the first year after Eleanor. The way idleness made grief louder. The way keeping your hands moving was sometimes the only thing that kept everything else from coming apart. Pearl had made herself entirely at home in the way that only children can, with a complete absence of self-consciousness that would have been impossible for any adult to manage. She'd claimed the stool by the stove as her reading spot. She'd established a morning routine of checking on General Sherman and reporting his behavior to Samuel with the gravity of a field commander delivering dispatches. She'd also, somewhere in the 2nd day, started calling him Samuel without the Mr. in front of it, and neither of them had remarked on when that had changed. On the morning of the 4th day, Samuel rode the fence line. He told himself it was routine. He told himself he needed to check the north post where the snow had been heavy. Both of those things were true. They were also not the reason he rode 3 miles out and sat on his horse in the cold for 20 minutes, studying the road that came up from the south. No tracks. Fresh snow had covered whatever had been there. That didn't mean nothing. It meant he couldn't read what was coming. He rode back. Dorothy was at the table when he came in, a piece of paper in front of her and a stub of pencil in her hand. She looked up, and something in his expression told her before he said a word. "You went to look," she said. "Fence line," he said. "Samuel." He pulled off his hat. "Nothing on the road. That doesn't mean they're gone." "It means they're waiting," she said. She set down the pencil. "Voss is patient. He'll wait until he knows more about the situation before he moves. He'll want to know who you are, what you have, whether you're the kind of man who can be bought or the kind who has to be removed." Samuel hung up his coat. "Which kind does he usually run into?" "The first kind," Dorothy said. "Most people can be bought, or scared. Voss is very good at knowing which lever to pull." She paused. "He's going to come at you, Samuel, not just me. He'll look for something to use against you."
Let him look, Samuel said.
Dorothy pushed back from the table and stood. "You don't know him." "No," Samuel said, "but he doesn't know me either." He looked at her steadily. "Dot, I've been on this land for 11 years. I've weathered bad prices, bad winters, and a grief that should have finished me and didn't. Whatever Harlan Voss thinks he's going to find to use against me, he's going to be disappointed." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the paper she'd been writing on and held it out. "I've been writing down everything I know. Every name, every date, what I saw, what Henry told me before he died. The lawyer in Laramie that Voss owns, the judge in Trinidad, the deputy he paid to look the other way." Her hand was steady, holding the paper, but her eyes weren't. "If something happens to me, this needs to exist somewhere." Samuel took the paper. He read it carefully, all the way through, and felt something harden in him as he read. Not anger, something colder and more purposeful than anger. The kind of thing that made a man methodical instead of reckless. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But this is good thinking." He folded the paper carefully and put it inside the cover of the Bible on the shelf. Not for religion, just because it was the last place someone would look. "We're going to need the sheriff." Dorothy made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I went to 3 sheriffs in Colorado." "I know Sheriff Briggs," Samuel said. "He's not the same kind." "You trust him?" Samuel thought about it honestly. "I trust that he's afraid of what comes after if he isn't straight. That's close enough." He turned. "I need to ride into Rollins tomorrow." "I don't want you going alone." "I'll be fine." "Samuel." Her voice had an edge to it now, not sharp, just firm.
I've watched 3 people go off alone to do something that felt safe and not come back. I'm not...
She stopped, pressed one hand flat against the table. "I'm not watching that again." He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window behind her, and he could see the exhaustion she carried. Not just from the sickness, but from 2 years of being the only one standing between Pearl and the worst thing imaginable. It had worn lines into her face that shouldn't have been there yet. It had made her careful in ways that cost her. "I'll take Billy Marsh," he said. "He's a ranch hand 2 miles east. Good man, good rifle. Will that do?" She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. "Yes." Pearl appeared in the doorway from the back room, her hair in 2 uneven braids she'd done herself, and her boots on the wrong feet. General Sherman escaped, she announced. Samuel looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at the ceiling.
I'll get him, Samuel said, and put his hat back on. He was halfway across the yard when he heard the door open behind him, and Pearl came running out, her coat half-buttoned, completely undeterred by the cold. She fell into step beside him with the ease of someone who'd been doing it for years.
I can help, she said. You've got your boots on wrong. She looked down. They still work. He didn't argue. They spent 20 minutes chasing General Sherman around the barn, and for those 20 minutes, Samuel did not think about Harlan Voss or the road south or the paper folded inside the Bible. He thought about nothing except a furious rooster and a red-haired girl who laughed every time the bird changed direction, bright and unguarded and completely present in a way he'd forgotten was possible. When they finally cornered the rooster against the water trough, and Pearl scooped him up with a triumphant sound, Samuel stood there breathing hard from the cold and the chase, and felt, absurdly, like something had cracked open inside him. Not broken, cracked open, the way frozen ground cracks in early spring. Not damage, just the beginning of something pushing through. Pearl looked up at him with the rooster tucked under her arm. You almost smiled, she said. I didn't. You did, right at the end. She tilted her head. You should do it more. It makes you look less like a storm cloud. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. This child. This absolute, fearless, thoroughly inconvenient child. Go put him back, he said. She went, singing something to the rooster under her breath that Samuel was fairly certain was a hymn she'd modified to be about chickens. He stood in the yard for another minute, looking at nothing in particular, and let himself feel the thing he'd been not feeling for 4 days. The house behind him was warm. There was food on the stove and voices inside, and boot prints in the snow that weren't his. The silence that had been his whole world for 3 years had been pushed back. Not gone, but pushed back, like darkness when you light a lamp. Eleanor would have liked Dorothy Calloway. The thought arrived without warning and didn't hurt the way he expected it to. It was just true. He went back inside. That night, after Pearl was asleep, Dorothy sat across from Samuel with 2 cups of coffee between them and said, Tell me about Eleanor. He looked up. You don't have to, she said quickly. Pearl asked me today why there's a woman's hairbrush on the shelf in the back room. And I realized I don't know anything about her except that she taught you to cook and she died. She paused. You know everything about me. It seemed uneven. Samuel wrapped both hands around his cup. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing against the walls with persistent, impersonal force. She was from Ohio, he said finally. Came west with her family when she was 16. I met her at a dance in Laramie. She stepped on my foot 3 times and apologized twice, and the 3rd time she just raised her eyebrow at me, like it was my fault for having feet. He paused. I asked her to marry me 6 weeks later. Dorothy smiled. That fast? When you know, he said. You know. He was quiet for a moment. She was the most practical woman I ever met. She didn't waste words, and she didn't waste time, and she never asked for things she didn't need. But she was... He stopped. She had a way of seeing people, right down to the thing they were actually afraid of. She never made you feel ashamed of it. She just saw it and kept looking at you like it didn't change anything. She sounds remarkable, Dorothy said softly. She was. He looked at his cup. She wanted children badly. We tried for 4 years. When she finally got pregnant, she was... His jaw tightened slightly. I've never seen her that happy. Not scared, just happy. All the way through. The whole 9 months. Like she'd been waiting her whole life for it, and she finally had it in her hands. He paused. The labor went wrong. The baby came early. Eleanor held on for 6 hours after, long enough to make me promise her things. Dorothy was very still.
What did you promise?
She asked, her voice barely above a murmur. That I'd keep the ranch, that I'd keep the lanterns burning. He looked up. That I wouldn't let myself disappear. Dorothy looked at him carefully.
Have you been keeping those promises?
He considered it honestly. The first 2, he said. I've been working on the third. She nodded slowly. There was no pity in her expression, which was exactly why he'd been able to say it. She just received it the way she received most things. Straight on, without flinching, without trying to fix what wasn't hers to fix. Henry didn't make me promise anything, she said after a moment. He didn't have time. Her fingers turned the cup slowly. The last thing he said to me was Pearl's name. That was it. Just Pearl. She swallowed. I think that was the promise. That her name was the last thing on his mind. He trusted you with her, Samuel said. Yes. Her voice steadied. He did. They sat in silence for a while, and it was the kind of silence that builds something rather than taking it away. Outside, the wind pressed and released, like breathing. The fire settled. Somewhere in the back room, Pearl shifted in her sleep and murmured something and went still again. I'm going to get past this, Dorothy said. Not to Samuel. Not exactly. More like saying it out loud so that the room could hold it too. I'm going to find a way to deal with Voss, and I'm going to find a piece of land, and I'm going to build something for Pearl that nobody can take. She paused. I just need a little ground to stand on first. You've got it, Samuel said. She looked at him. You say that like it's simple. It is, he said. You're here, I'm here. That's ground. Something moved through her expression that she didn't try to name, and neither did he. It was too new and too careful for names yet. The way ice on a creek in early spring is too new for weight. It might hold, it might not. And the wisest thing is to move carefully and find out. She stood, picked up both cups, and took them to the basin. Samuel watched her move through the lamplight, straight-backed and deliberate. A woman putting herself back together, one small decision at a time. I used to be afraid of men like you, she said, not turning around. Like me? Men who don't say much. She set the cups down. In my experience, quiet men were quiet because they had things to hide. And now? Samuel asked. She turned. Now I think some men are quiet because they're paying attention. She almost smiled again. This time it made it all the way. Good night, Samuel. Good night, Dot. She disappeared into the back room. Samuel sat for a moment longer, then stood and went to the window. The lanterns on the porch were burning steady, 2 amber points holding their own against the dark. He'd lit them again tonight without thinking, the way he always did, the way Eleanor had asked him to. He put his hand flat against the cold glass and looked out at the road. He'd ridden to Billy Marsh's place that afternoon, before dinner, quick enough that neither Dorothy nor Pearl had fully registered how long he'd been gone. Billy was a solid man, not easily rattled, the kind of steady that came from decades of work and weather. He'd listened to everything Samuel told him with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, and when Samuel finished, Billy had said simply, I'll be here before sunup. That helped. That was one solid thing. But it wasn't enough, and Samuel knew it. Briggs needed to know. The paper in the Bible needed to be somewhere safer than a Bible. And whatever Boss was planning, Samuel would rather know the shape of it before it arrived at his door than after. He thought about Dorothy's face when she'd said, I'm not watching that again. He thought about Pearl chasing a rooster in wrong-footed boots, laughing without reservation, as if the world had not already taken her father and her home and 2 years of her childhood. He thought about the promises he'd made Eleanor, the ones he'd kept, and the one he'd been failing. He looked at the lanterns, looked at the door.
Then he went to the shelf, took down the Bible, unfolded Dorothy's paper, and read it through a second time. More carefully this time, name by name, date by date, looking for the pieces he could use. Because Harlan Voss was coming. That was certain. Men with that kind of money and that kind of patience always came eventually. And Samuel Reed was going to be ready. Billy Marsh arrived before the sky had fully decided to be morning. Samuel heard his horse on the road and was already at the door with his coat on before Billy had dismounted. They stood on the porch for 5 minutes, speaking low and fast, the way men who trust each other speak when time is short. Billy had seen tracks on the south road the evening before. 2 horses, maybe 3, moving slow and stopping twice near the property line. Watching. "How long do you think we have?" Samuel asked. Billy pulled at the corner of his mustache, a habit Samuel had known for 11 years. "Voss isn't stupid. He won't send those 2 back in. He'll want someone with authority, someone who can make it look legal." He paused. "I'd say 3 days, maybe 4. "That's enough," Samuel said. "Ride with me to Rollins today." Already planning on it. They went inside. Dorothy was awake. Samuel suspected she hadn't slept much, and standing at the stove with her back straight and her jaw set. Pearl was still asleep. Dorothy looked at Billy once, measured him the same way she'd measured Samuel that first morning, and then poured him a cup of coffee without being asked, which Samuel understood was her version of approval. "Billy Marsh," Samuel said. "He's with us." "Ma'am," Billy said, taking the cup with a nod. Dorothy set her own cup down and looked at Samuel. "What's the plan?" "We ride to Rollins, see Sheriff Briggs, show him the paper." He paused. "I've also been thinking about Judge Alderman. He's 2 counties over, but he's clean. I've known him since the land disputes of '73. If we can get the paper in front of him, Voss loses his legal cover." Dorothy's expression moved through several things at once. "Briggs might wire Voss's people before you clear the county line." "He might," Samuel said, "but I don't think he will. Briggs doesn't like trouble, and Voss is trouble wearing a hat. The moment Briggs understands there's documentation, real names, real dates, he's going to want to be on the right side of this." "You're betting a lot on a lawman's instinct for self-preservation," Dorothy said. "I've won on worse odds," Samuel said. She looked at him for a moment, then at Billy, then back at Samuel. "I want to come." Samuel had expected this. He'd been thinking about his answer since the night before. "No," he said. Her eyes went sharp immediately. "Don't." "Not because you can't handle it," he said, before she could finish the sentence. "Because if Voss's men are watching that road, and they see you on it, everything moves faster and harder than we're ready for. Right now they know where you are, but they don't have a reason to act yet. You walking into Rollins gives them one." She pressed her lips together. He could see her running the logic of it, hating that it was sound. "Pearl stays here with you," he continued. "There's a rifle behind the bedroom door and another one in the barn. You know how to use them." He said the last part as a statement, not a question, because he'd seen the way she'd watched him clean his own rifle 2 days ago. Not with the blankness of someone unfamiliar, but with the quiet attention of someone reviewing something they already knew. She confirmed it with a single nod. "I know how." "Good." He picked up his hat. "Bar the door while we're gone. Don't open it for anyone you don't recognize. Anyone comes to that door, you put yourself between them and Pearl, and you wait." "How long will you be gone?" 5 hours, 6 at most. He hesitated, then said what he hadn't planned to say. "I'm coming back, Dot." She held his gaze. Something shifted in the back of her eyes.
Not softness exactly. More like the dropping of a guard that had been up so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it. "I know," she said quietly. "Go." He and Billy rode out as the sun was climbing. The road to Rollins was 14 miles on a good day, 12 if you pushed and the snow cooperated. They pushed. Samuel kept his eyes on the tree lines, on the road ahead, on every place where two men on horses could sit in shadow and count what passed. He saw nothing. That didn't settle him. Billy rode beside him and talked in the measured way he always talked, low and steady, about the things that needed to be said. He'd heard of Harlan Voss, not personally, but the name had a shape in the territory. The shape of a man who'd spent 30 years accumulating things and had never once given anything back. The kind of rich, Billy said, that doesn't remember it used to be something else. He had a man killed, Samuel said. A good man by all accounts. Left a widow and a child. And the widow ran north, Billy said. And knocked on my door, Samuel said. Billy was quiet for a moment. Eleanor would have liked her. Samuel looked straight ahead. "Yeah," he said. "She would have." Rollins was half awake when they rode in, the main street carrying the particular mid-morning energy of a town that worked hard and didn't apologize for being tired. Samuel tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and went in without knocking. Briggs was at his desk, a heavy-set man with a careful face and the kind of stillness that came from spending years deciding what was worth reacting to. He looked up when Samuel came in, registered Billy behind him, and set down his pen with the deliberate calm of a man who understood that when Samuel Reed came to town, it was not for coffee and conversation. "Reed," he said. "Been a while." "It has." Samuel pulled out the folded paper and set it on the desk. "I need 10 minutes. Briggs looked at the paper, then at Samuel. Then he sat back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Talk." Samuel talked. He laid it out clean and direct. Dorothy Calloway, Henry Calloway's death, Voss, the names on the paper, the men who'd shown up at his fence line, the tracks Billy had seen. Briggs listened without interrupting, his face doing the careful calculations of a man who understood that what he said next was going to matter. When Samuel finished, Briggs unfolded the paper and read it. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the desk and put both palms on top of it, the way a man secures something he doesn't want blown away. "Harlan Voss," Briggs said. "You know him?" "Know of him." Briggs looked up. "He's got a lawyer who wrote me 2 months ago. Inquiry about any John Doe widows passing through with a child from Colorado." Dressed it up in legal language, but the meaning was plain enough. Samuel felt something cold move through him. "What did you write back?" "Nothing," Briggs said, "because I had nothing to tell." He paused. "Now I do." He looked at the paper again. "Judge Alderman?" "That's my thought," Samuel said. "If this gets in front of Alderman before Voss can move, Voss loses his legal angle. Without that, he's just a man sending hired hands onto private property." "Which is a different kind of problem," Briggs said slowly. "One you can handle," Samuel said. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what you're doing here, Reed. You're not just protecting a woman on your land. You're making an enemy of a man who has the patience and the money to make that uncomfortable for you indefinitely." "I understand," Samuel said. "And?" "And I'm still here," Samuel said, "asking for 10 minutes of your time." Briggs held his gaze. Then he nodded once, slowly. The nod of a man making a decision he'd been moving toward without knowing it. "I'll wire Alderman today. I'll also put it on record that I've received a formal complaint from a resident regarding armed men on private property." He looked at Billy. "You'll sign as witness?" "Already got my pen out," Billy said. It took 40 minutes, not 10. Samuel stood at the window of Briggs's office while Billy and the sheriff worked through the paperwork, and watched the street, and thought about Dorothy standing at his stove with her back straight and her jaw set, holding herself together through sheer force of the kind of will that doesn't announce itself. He thought about the way she'd said, "I know." Just that. Not "be careful" or "come back safe." Just, "I know," with everything underneath it left unsaid. The way the most important things between people so often were. On the street below, he saw something that made him go still. Clem Oates, the younger one, the one who kept his hand too close to his hip, was walking out of the general store across the street. He hadn't seen Samuel yet. He was carrying a paper-wrapped parcel and moving with the easy stride of a man who wasn't hiding. Which meant he didn't know Samuel had come to town. Which meant he thought he had time. Samuel turned from the window. "Briggs." Briggs looked up. "One of Voss's men is across the street." Briggs stood. He didn't rush, didn't reach for his gun. Just stood with the careful authority of a man who understood the value of measured action. He went to the window and looked. "Oates," he said, like he recognized him. "You know him?" "He passed through 2 weeks ago. Asked about land registry." Didn't like the answers. Briggs picked up his hat. "Stay here." "No," Samuel said. Briggs looked at him. "If he sees you come out of your office alone, he wires Voss before dark, and Voss moves up his timeline. But if he sees me," Samuel paused, "let me talk to him first." Briggs considered it for exactly 3 seconds. "Don't start anything I have to finish." "I won't start anything," Samuel said. "I'm just going to let him know the situation has changed." He went out alone. Oates saw him before Samuel reached the middle of the street, and the recognition moved through the younger man's face in a clear sequence. Surprise, calculation, and then the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to run or stand. He stood. That told Samuel something. Either he was braver than he looked, or he'd been told not to run. "Morning," Samuel said, stopping 10 feet away. Oates shifted the parcel under his arm. "Read." "You know my name," Samuel said. "That's good. Saves time." He kept his voice level and his hands loose and visible. "I want you to carry a message back to Voss for me." "I don't know what you're—" "Don't," Samuel said quietly. "We'll pass that." Oates closed his mouth. "Tell him Dorothy Calloway has given a full written testimony to Sheriff Briggs of Carbon County, with copies made and sent to Judge Alderman's office in Laramie. Every name, every date, every man Voss paid and what he paid them for." Samuel watched the younger man's face carefully. The color had shifted. "Tell him Henry Calloway's death is now a matter on official record. Tell him the next man who sets foot on my property gets escorted off it by the law." He paused. "And tell him that if anything happens to that woman or that child, anything of any kind at any time, those documents become public." Oates said nothing for a moment. His jaw was tight.
You think a piece of paper's going to stop him? I think a piece of paper in the right hands stops a lot of things, Samuel said. Because Voss doesn't survive if this becomes public. He's spent 30 years building something. It all comes down on the day his name is in the newspaper for what he did to a man with a wife and a little girl. He held Oates's gaze. He knows that. You know that. That's why he's been moving quietly. Samuel took one step forward. The quiet's done now. Oates looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked past Samuel's shoulder, at the sheriff's office, at Briggs standing in the doorway, arms crossed, badge catching the thin winter light. Oates looked back at Samuel. You made yourself an enemy, Oates said. He was already my enemy, Samuel replied. He just didn't know it yet. He stepped back and gestured down the road with one hand.
The same gesture he'd used the first time he'd sent these men off his land. Simple. Clear. Final. Ride on.
Oates rode on. Samuel stood in the street until the sound of hooves faded, then turned and walked back to Briggs's office. Billy was at the window. "That was either very smart or very reckless," Billy said. "Probably both," Samuel said. "How fast can Alderman get those documents registered?" "3 days if Briggs wires today," Briggs said from behind his desk. "2 if I mark it urgent." "Mark it urgent," Samuel said. They rode back in the afternoon. The sky was low and gray, the kind of flat winter light that made everything feel both sharp and shadowless. Billy talked less on the return. Samuel's mind was running ahead of the horses, back to the ranch, to the bar on the door, to Pearl in her wrong-footed boots, to Dorothy, who knew how to use a rifle and had chosen not to mention it until asked. He found himself thinking about what Voss would do next. The paper was insurance, not protection. A man like Voss had survived long enough to understand the difference between a fight and a war. And what Samuel had done today was change the nature of the engagement. Voss would recalculate. He would look for the softest point and apply pressure there. The softest point, Samuel knew, was Dorothy herself. Not physically. Voss wasn't stupid enough to send men to do something overt, not now that there was a record. But there were other ways to pressure a woman. Legal challenges to land rights she didn't fully have yet. Rumors sent ahead to any town she might try to settle in. Ways of making the ground unstable under her feet without ever putting a hand on her. Samuel thought about this the whole ride back, and by the time the ranch came into view, lit warm against the early dusk, the 2 lanterns burning steady on the porch, he had decided something. Dorothy opened the door before he'd finished tying his horse. She stood in the doorway with the rifle at her side, not raised, just held, easy and ready. And she looked at him the way she had looked at him that first morning when she'd been measuring whether he was safe or wasn't. He understood now that she was always measuring. 2 years of survival had made it automatic. "How did it go?" she asked. "Good," he said. "Better than expected." He came up the steps and stopped in front of her. Pearl appeared behind her mother in the doorway, peering around her hip. "Are you 2 all right?" "Fine," Dorothy said. "Nobody came. Pearl taught General Sherman a new trick." "He can walk backward now," Pearl reported seriously. Samuel looked at her, then back at Dorothy. "I need to talk to you," he said. "After Pearl's asleep." Dorothy read something in his face. She nodded and stepped back to let him in. Dinner that night was quieter than usual, but not uncomfortably so. Pearl carried most of the conversation, describing General Sherman's backward walking demonstration in more detail than the subject warranted, and then pivoting without transition into a series of questions about whether stars were the same stars in Wyoming as in Colorado, or different ones. Samuel answered each question as straight as he could, which Pearl seemed to appreciate more than vague reassurances. After Pearl was asleep, Dorothy came back to the table and sat across from him. She wrapped both hands around her cup and waited. She was very good at waiting. She'd learned to let silence do its work without filling it. "Voss is going to step back," Samuel said. "Not because he's giving up. Because I've made the direct approach too costly. He's going to try to make things difficult for you without touching you. Make it hard to settle, hard to find ground." He paused. "He's going to try to make Wyoming feel as unsafe as Colorado did." Dorothy absorbed this. "You're saying it's not over." "I'm saying it's different now," Samuel said, "which is better than it was." He looked at her directly. "But the only real way to stop him is to be somewhere he can't follow, somewhere with roots he can't pull out." He paused. "I've been thinking about that all afternoon." She looked at him carefully.
"What are you saying, Samuel?" He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I'm saying this ranch has been standing for 11 years, and it's going to stand for 40 more. I'm saying Voss can't touch what's properly filed, properly witnessed, and properly defended." He paused once more, choosing the next words with the care of a man who understood they were going to change things. "I'm saying there are ways to make you harder to move than you've ever been. Legally. Officially." He held her gaze. "If you wanted that." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the dark. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, with those creek-water eyes that never looked at anything halfway. He didn't look away. He waited the way she'd taught him, without filling the silence. "That's a big thing to say," she said finally. "I know," Samuel said. "You've known me 9 days." "I know that too." She looked down at her cup. When she looked back up, something in her had shifted. Not decided, not yet, but open. The guard that had been up since before he'd ever met her had moved, just slightly, just enough. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "when the ground dries." Samuel nodded. "All right." He stood, put on his coat, and went out to check the horses and the barn, the way he did every night, walking through the cold with the lanterns burning behind him, and the stars overhead, and the particular feeling of a man who has said the true thing and let it stand without pushing. When he came back in, the house was quiet, both of them asleep. He sat in his chair by the window, rifle on his knee, and watched the dark road south. Voss would move again. Samuel didn't doubt that. But tonight, the lanterns were burning, and the door was locked. And for the first time in 3 years, keeping watch felt less like grief and more like purpose. The wire from Judge Alderman came on the 5th day. Briggs wrote it out himself, which told Samuel everything he needed to know about how seriously the sheriff was taking things now that his name was on the paperwork. He arrived mid-morning, tied his horse at the post, and came up the porch steps with the careful expression of a man carrying news that could go either way. Samuel opened the door before he knocked. "Documents are registered," Briggs said, without preamble. "Alderman moved fast. Faster than I expected." He handed Samuel the wire. "Boss's lawyer in Trinidad has already been notified." Alderman's words, not mine. "Any further action against Dorothy Calloway or her property interests will be treated as obstruction of an active inquiry into the death of Henry Calloway." Samuel read the wire twice. Then he looked up. "An active inquiry?" "Alderman's opening one," Briggs said. "Officially. He's requesting sworn statements from 2 witnesses in Colfax County, who apparently have been waiting for someone with enough authority to ask." He paused. "Turns out, Dorothy Calloway wasn't the only one Harlan Voss pushed off her land. She was just the only one who ran far enough and smart enough to stay alive." Samuel stood in the doorway and felt something in his chest loosen. Not relief exactly. Something larger than relief. The particular release of a tension that had been so constant he'd stopped feeling it as separate from everything else. "Does she know?" Briggs asked, nodding toward the house. "Not yet," Samuel said. "Come in." Dorothy was at the table with Pearl, working through arithmetic on a piece of brown paper. Pearl had her tongue between her teeth, and the expression of someone doing battle with a column of numbers and losing with dignity. Dorothy looked up when the 2 men came in and read Briggs's face before either of them spoke. She stood. Samuel handed her the wire. She read it standing, one hand flat on the table, the other holding the paper steady. She read it the same way she'd held herself through everything, straight-backed, controlled, not letting anything show until she understood the full shape of it. Then she reached the last line, and Samuel watched something happen in her face that she couldn't control and didn't try to. Her chin dropped. Just for a second. Just long enough for one breath to come out shaky. Pearl looked up from her arithmetic. "Mama?" Dorothy straightened. She folded the wire carefully, the way you fold something you're going to keep, and set it on the table. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, but her voice was even. "It's good news, Pearl," she said. Pearl looked at Samuel for confirmation. He nodded once. She seemed to accept this as sufficient and went back to her arithmetic. Dorothy looked at Briggs. "Thank you," she said. "I know this wasn't without risk for you." Briggs pulled at the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I've been a sheriff for 14 years. Every now and then a case comes through that reminds you why you took the job." He looked at Samuel. "Voss isn't finished. I want to be straight about that. Alderman's inquiry closes off the legal angle, but Voss is a proud man, and proud men don't always act sensibly when they've been cornered." He picked up his hat. "I'd keep the lanterns burning a while longer." "Already planned on it," Samuel said. After Briggs left, the house held a particular quiet. Not the quiet of tension or waiting, but something more like the quiet after a long storm, when the air is clean and everything is still, and you breathe it in because you can. Pearl finished her arithmetic and pushed the paper toward her mother. "I got the last one wrong on purpose," she announced. Dorothy looked at the paper. "Why?" "Because I wanted you to find something to correct," Pearl said seriously. "You look better when you're correcting things." Dorothy stared at her daughter for a moment. Then she laughed. A real one, sudden and unguarded. The kind that came from somewhere below decision. And Samuel, standing at the window with his coffee, felt the sound of it move through the room, like the first warm day after a long winter. He turned away to look out the window, because some moments belong to the people inside them. That afternoon, while Pearl was in the barn attempting to teach General Sherman to walk sideways, Dorothy came to find Samuel at the fence line, where he was replacing a post that had heaved up through the frost. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside him, with her hands in her coat pockets, watching him work the way she'd watched him work since the beginning. Not idle watching, but the attentive kind, like she was learning something she hadn't decided to learn yet. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "about what you said 4 nights ago." Samuel kept working. "I figured you would be." "I want to ask you something first." "Ask." She turned slightly toward him. "Do you want this? Not out of decency, not because Eleanor asked you to stay open to things. You, Samuel. What you actually want." He set down the post driver and looked at her directly, the way she'd always looked at him. Straight on, no softening of the lens. "Yes," he said. "I want this." She held his gaze. "Even knowing what comes with it? Voss isn't the last problem we'll have. Pearl asks questions every minute of every day, and she's not going to stop. I'm not easy. I don't trust fast, and I don't bend easy, and I have opinions about most things, and I'll say them." "I know all of that," Samuel said. "And I'm still standing here," he said, "asking you to stay." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, the wind pushing at her hair, her eyes doing that careful measuring that he'd come to understand was not suspicion, but precision. The exactness of a woman who'd been wrong about safety before and couldn't afford to be wrong again. "I'll stay," she said. "Not because I need to, because I want to." The difference mattered. He understood that. He nodded once, slow and certain, and she nodded back. And that was the agreement. No ceremony, no grand declaration, just 2 people who'd been through enough to know that the quiet things were the ones that held. She reached out and picked up the other end of the fence post, steadying it without being asked. He drove it in. They worked the fence line together for the rest of the afternoon, without needing to say much else. The next 2 weeks moved with a different rhythm than the ones before. Not easier exactly, but more deliberate, the way a river moves when it's found its proper channel. Samuel rode to Rollins twice more for meetings with Briggs, bringing Billy along each time, and coming back with updates from Alderman's inquiry that were steadily building into something Voss could not dismantle. 2 of the witnesses in Colfax County had given sworn statements. A third was considering it. The deputy who'd filed the fraudulent robbery report on Henry Calloway's death had resigned without explanation, which Briggs said meant he'd been told to by someone above him who'd done the arithmetic on what exposure looked like.
Harlan Voss had gone quiet in a way that didn't mean surrender. Men like Voss never surrendered, but meant he was recalculating, looking for a new angle, buying time. "He'll try something in the spring," Billy said one evening, sitting at Samuel's table with a cup of coffee and the particular directness he used when he was saying the thing nobody wanted to say first. "When the road's clear and he can move easier. He'll try to make it personal rather than legal. Something that can't be documented." "I know," Samuel said. "You'll need more than a wire from Alderman if it gets physical." "I know that too," Samuel said. "That's why I'm talking to Hennessy and Farrow about organizing the ranchers." Billy raised his eyebrows. "Jack Hennessy's going to cooperate with you?" "Jack Hennessy's got a daughter who works in Laramie and a son on a homestead in Colorado. When I told him what Voss does to small landholders who won't sell, he stopped being difficult very fast." Samuel set his cup down. "Voss can move against one man. He can't move against 7 who've all signed their names to the same complaint." Billy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor would have handled this the same way." "She would have been smarter about it," Samuel said. "Maybe," Billy said. "But she would have been proud of how you're doing it." Samuel looked at the table. He let that sit for a moment, feeling the truth of it without flinching from it. He was getting better at that, letting things be true without needing to protect himself from them. The night before the ranchers' meeting, Pearl couldn't sleep. She came out of the back room, wrapped in her blanket, and sat in the chair by the fire without explanation, the way she sometimes did when something was working in her mind that she hadn't finished yet. Samuel was at the table. Dorothy was mending by the lamp. "Samuel," Pearl said. "Are the bad men going to go away now?" He looked up. She was watching the fire with the serious expression she wore when she was asking something she'd already thought through from several angles. "They're going to go far enough away that they can't reach us," Samuel said. "That's what we're working on." Pearl considered this. "Is that the same as gone?" "It's close enough to matter," Samuel said. She seemed to weigh that. Then she said, "My papa used to say that some people are like winter. They don't go away because you want them to. They go away when the season changes." The room was quiet. Dorothy had stopped mending. Samuel looked at this child, this fierce, observant, irreplaceable child who had walked through a blizzard at midnight and changed the course of 3 lives without understanding that she was doing it. "Your papa was right," Samuel said. "I know," Pearl said, with simple certainty. "He usually was." She pulled her blanket tighter. "I think the season's changing." Samuel looked at Dorothy. She was watching her daughter with that expression she sometimes wore when she thought no one was looking. Completely unguarded, all the survival stripped away. Just a mother looking at the thing she loved most in the world. She caught Samuel looking. She didn't look away. "Go to sleep, Pearl," she said softly. "I'm not tired." "You said that last night." "Last night I was right." Pearl. Pearl sighed with the full drama of someone who has many important thoughts and insufficient hours to share them.
She stood, dragged the blanket back toward the bedroom, and paused in the doorway.
Samuel, she said.
Yes?
When the season changes,
She tilted her head, the gesture she made before saying something she'd been working up to.
are we going to stay here? For real?
The question landed with all its weight. Samuel looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at Samuel. The understanding between them, the thing that had been building since the first morning, through every quiet hour and shared silence, and moment of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier, passed between them clearly. Yes, Samuel said. For real. Pearl nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Good, she said. I told General Sherman, and he seemed relieved. She disappeared into the back room. Dorothy pressed her lips together, fighting something that was either a laugh or tears, or both. She told the rooster, she said. Seems reasonable, Samuel said. Dorothy set down her mending and crossed to the table and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the lamplight, the way two people look when they are standing on the same side of something they've both been through and survived. Are you scared? She asked. Of what? This, she said simply. Starting something again. After. He thought about it honestly because she deserved that. Yes, he said, but not the way I was scared of the dark when Eleanor died. That fear was... It was the fear of a man who thought happiness was something that only happened once, and getting it again meant betraying the first time. He paused. I don't think that anymore. What changed it? Pearl knocked on my door, he said, and you opened your eyes and measured me instead of thanking me. And I thought, that's a woman who hasn't stopped fighting. He looked at her. It reminded me what fighting looks like. I'd forgotten. Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hand was steady and warm, and had worked hard, and intended to keep working hard, and there was nothing fragile about the gesture, which was exactly why it moved him. I'm not Eleanor, she said, quietly. Not as a warning, just as a fact that needed saying. No, Samuel said. You're Dorothy Calloway, who drove 300 miles through winter with $12 and a rifle you didn't mention until I asked. He turned his hand over beneath hers. That's enough. That's more than enough. The spring did not arrive like a declaration. It came the way all the true things had come, quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of ordinary life. The morning Samuel noticed the first green pushing through the mud by the south fence, Pearl was already there. She was crouching in her boots and her coat, poking at the ground with one finger, with the focused attention of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. It's there, she said, when Samuel came to stand beside her. It is, he said. I've been checking every morning, she said, for 6 days. She stood up and looked at him seriously. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to say it until it was real. Samuel understood that completely. Smart, he said. She looked at the green chute, then at the ranch, then at him. Samuel, she said, I want to ask you something. Ask. She took a breath with the seriousness of someone about to say the most important thing they've said all year. Could I mean, if it was all right with you and Mama both. She stopped, tried again. Is it all right if I call you Pa? The word hit him somewhere so deep and so specific that he couldn't immediately speak. He looked at this red-haired girl who had knocked on his door in the dark and handed him back his own life without knowing that's what she was doing. And he felt 11 years of this land and 3 years of grief, and every cold morning he'd gotten up and kept going because Eleanor had asked him to. All of it, come together into this single moment. This child's face, looking up at him, waiting for an answer. He crouched down to her level, the way he had the very first night. "Yes," he said. "It's all right with me." Pearl threw her arms around his neck with the complete physical commitment that children bring to everything, and Samuel put one hand on the back of her red head and held on. When she pulled back, she was grinning, wholly and without reservation, the grin of a child who has gotten the thing she asked for and isn't bothering to be modest about it. "I'm going to tell General Sherman," she announced, and ran back toward the barn. Samuel stayed crouching by the fence for a moment, one hand resting on the ground where the green had come through. He heard the door of the ranch house open behind him. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. He'd learned the particular sound of Dorothy's footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a woman who knew where she was going. She came and stood beside him. He stood up. "She asked you, didn't she?" Dorothy said. Not a question. "She did." Dorothy looked at the green shoot for a moment.
She asked me 2 days ago if I thought you'd say yes. She paused. I told her I thought you would.
"You were right," Samuel said. She looked at him sideways, and the almost smile he'd seen that very first morning, the one that had started as barely there and built itself up through every hard day between then and now, arrived fully, without qualification, the smile of a woman who was no longer just surviving. "I know," she said. The same 2 words she'd said the morning he rode to Rollins and told her he was coming back. But they meant more now. They carried more ground under them. Samuel looked out over the land. His land. Their land, if she'd have it. And she would, because Dorothy Calloway had come too far and fought too hard to stop short of a thing worth having. The inquiry would continue into summer. Voss would make one more attempt in April, sending a lawyer with documents designed to complicate Dorothy's standing in Wyoming territory. And that lawyer would find Sheriff Briggs and 6 signed rancher affidavits and Judge Alderman's formal correspondence waiting for him. And he would ride back to Colorado with nothing accomplished and everything spent. Harlan Voss would not try again after that. Not because he'd become a better man, but because the calculation had finally turned against him. Too much exposure, too little return, too many people who knew his name attached to the wrong things. Men like Voss survived by staying in shadow. Samuel had pulled him into the light, and light was the one thing that kind of man could not afford. But that was still weeks away, and this morning was this morning. Green pushing through frozen ground, Pearl's laughter floating out of the barn, the ranch breathing around them with the particular ease of a place that had found its right number of people. Samuel turned to Dorothy. "I was thinking about the south field," he said. "There's good soil down there, protected from the worst of the north wind. If we put up a small fence, it'd make a decent kitchen garden." Dorothy looked at the south field. Then she looked at him. "I was thinking the same thing last week," she said. "I didn't say anything because—" She paused. "Because it felt like planning," Samuel said. "Yes," her voice was quiet. "And planning felt dangerous," he said. "Presumptuous," she said. He looked at her. "Plan," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment, and what moved through her face in that moment was the full distance of everything she'd traveled. The grief, the running, the cold, the fear, the careful armor she'd built, and the slow, deliberate choice to set it down. And on the other side of all of it, this man, this land, this morning, this green thing pushing up through frost-cracked earth. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady and sure and entirely her own. "The south field, kitchen garden. We'll need posts and wire." "Billy can help," Samuel said. "Billy helps with everything," she noted. "He does," Samuel agreed. "He's that kind of man." They walked back toward the house together, side by side, their boots leaving 2 sets of prints in the soft mud of early spring. Pearl emerged from the barn at a run, General Sherman nowhere in sight, and fell into step between them without breaking stride, reaching up to take Dorothy's hand on one side and Samuel's on the other, as naturally and completely as if she'd been doing it all her life. The ranch stood around them in the morning light. The house, with its burning lanterns, extinguished at last. The barn, where a rooster with too much confidence was learning to walk in directions nature hadn't intended. The fence line stretching out to meet the horizon, solid and true, repaired post by post through the long winter by a man who had learned that keeping something standing was its own kind of faith. Samuel looked at the lanterns on the porch, dark now in the daylight. He thought about Eleanor, the way he always would, the way a man carries a love that has ended, not as a wound, not anymore, but as the ground he'd been built on, the foundation beneath everything that had come after.
She had asked him to keep the lanterns burning, and he had, through 3 years of cold and quiet, until the night a child knocked on his door, and the burning became something different than it had been. Not a vigil, but a signal. Not grief holding on, but a man saying to the dark, "Here, I am here. Come if you need to." And she had come, and she had stayed. He didn't need the lanterns anymore for what they'd been. The light they'd been calling for had arrived. Pearl swung between them once, her boots lifting off the mud, and laughed at the feeling of it. And Samuel Reed, a man who had buried a photograph in frozen ground and dug it back up because he couldn't leave it there. A man who had sealed a house against feeling, and then opened his door at midnight to a child's voice in a blizzard, held on, and felt the full, uncomplicated weight of a life that had come back to itself. Some knocks change everything. He had learned to answer them.